when it comes to historical method, my favorite philosopher of history is Behan McCullough, a historian, philosopher of history in Australia, retired a few years ago. And he actually has spelled out a specific criteria for assessing hypotheses. So one would be explanatory scope. You take all the data into consideration, and which hypothesis explains the maximum of all that data. The one that explains the most data is to be preferred over the one that can't explain some of the data.
So I just wanted to stop him right here and say that explanatory scope is very important. Your hypothesis can't leave out certain things that it can't explain. It has to cover everything in it. But these are just kind of a very superficial, first thing to bring up, because you can have a hypothesis that has full explanatory scope for anything that comes up. But whether or not that hypothesis is actually supported by any kind of underlying evidence is another question entirely, and is addressed in the historical method that Licona is going over here.
Explanatory power. Given the truth of the hypothesis, what kind of data do we expect? To the extent that we get that data, a hypothesis may be said to have explanatory power. So, and the one that it can account for the most in that sense, and almost like predicts it, what we have, that the one with the greatest explanatory power is to be preferred.
Again, with explanatory power, it's very similar to explanatory scope. The hypothesis has to be able to explain these things in some kind of reasonable or rational way. But again, the same thing with explanatory scope is that you have to have underlying evidence in order to support your hypothesis.
A third criterion is less ad hoc. Now, ad hoc is Latin meaning for this. You hear about an ad hoc committee. An ad hoc committee is formed in order to address a specific issue. Otherwise, the committee wouldn't exist. We might think of it as improvisation. So in every hypothesis, there's going to be some degree of improvisation, a degree of non-evidenced assumptions. So the hypothesis that is least ad hoc is to be preferred.
I would totally agree with this. But the problem is that with Mike Licona and Gary Habermas is that they ad hoc presuppose that God exists. They haven't established that God exists. Both Mike Licona and Gary Habermas build their entire argument for the resurrection on the ad hoc presumption that both God exists, Jesus existed, and that God wanted to raise Jesus from the dead. These are unsupported assumptions that are ad hoc that they tack onto their argument, and thus ends up violating this particular key point in the historical method.
And then finally is plausibility. Plausibility is the degree to which a hypothesis is compatible with our background knowledge. So if the hypothesis is that a 2-year-old boy bench pressed 200 pounds, we'd say based on our background knowledge, that hypothesis is implausible. But if we add something in it, like a big muscle man, a bodybuilder, helped that 2-year-old bench press, well, then it becomes plausible. So the hypothesis that is most plausible is to be preferred.
Plausibility is another very big tenet to the historical method. The ad hoc presupposition that God is plausible and therefore is most likely to exist is something that they can't actually support with good evidence. Their entire case for the resurrection is built on that, and we are about to go through Gary Habermas's 6 minimal facts that supposedly prove a resurrection. But before we get into it, I want you guys to keep these 4 things in mind: explanatory scope, explanatory power, little to no ad hoc assertions or assumptions, and finally, plausibility. With the argument for the resurrection, the plausibility for it is very weak to start out with. First of all, nobody in the past has been known to actually resurrect in the way that Jesus has said to resurrect. You could equivocate it with like dying and then coming back to life or being brought back to life by either CPR or something like that, but that's not really the kind of resurrection that we're talking about with Jesus. Every single figure in the past that has matched the same kind of class of person or deity that Jesus supposedly is has either never existed or has never actually resurrected from the dead. So already the plausibility of a resurrection is very low. What you have to have is an extreme amount of evidence, and direct evidence at that, in order to overcome this immense implausibility. And so now we're going to go into Gary Habermas's 6 facts for the resurrection.